여러분, 안녕하세요. Thank you very much, Philip, for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to today's discussion on hydrogen and the opportunities between Australia and Korea. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And a big thank you again to the Asia Society and all the team for the hard work that you've put in for today's event, and also to ANZ for hosting this event today. It's a really exciting time in the Australia-Korea relationship. It's been a blockbuster, I'd say 12 to 18 months, largely driven by both of our nations' desire to transition to a lower carbon future, and also some of the geopolitical challenges that our region now faces. So I'm delighted to moderate today's panel to explore some of the opportunities between Australia and Korea in hydrogen. And I'd like to start with you, Liz, with a bit of a scene-setting question, if I can. In your policy memo, you state that Korea's green energy transition is one of the most ambitious in the world to date. What exactly makes it so unique compared to other advanced nations? And what can Australia learn from its example?
Thank you, Liz. Great question, and a big thank you to the Asia Society too for hosting this great event today. So I come to this question from the perspective of a political scientist, and as a political scientist who's really interested in the strategic role of the state, of national governments in techno-industrial transformation, especially in East Asia. So from that perspective, what's really distinctive about Korea's Green New Deal is the fact that it forms part of a much broader techno-industrial transformation strategy. And that strategy isn't aimed at addressing climate change, at least not principally, but really it's aimed at establishing Korea as a leader in the high-tech, high-waged, export-oriented manufacturing industries of the future. So in this sense, what really makes Korea's Green New Deal very distinctive is that it shares many of the features of the strategic techno-industrial development plans that have really characterised Korea's remarkable development trajectory since the 1960s. So like those strategies of the past, we find Korea's Green New Deal characterised by a very high level of ambition and commitment on the part of both the policy and the political elite. And I think that you see this high level of ambition and commitment reflected across five key areas I'll just touch on really briefly. So first, it's evident in the development of really detailed, very long-term industry development plans that are centred in industries that are deemed really essential to success. From hydrogen fuel cells to modular smart grids to electric vehicles and batteries and beyond. So if we think just about hydrogen, for example, you know, Korea sets its sights on being a global leader, aiming to make hydrogen its single largest energy source by 2050, with green hydrogen making up almost all of that. But importantly, it's not just about that green energy uptake. This is really about localizing the industry and building the supply chain. So, you know, as Korea consumes more and more green energy, more and more hydrogen, it will be doing that, producing the hydrogen using locally developed fuel cells fed into locally developed smart grids backed up by locally developed batteries, and Koreans will be driving locally developed hydrogen fuel cell EVs and charging at a kind of locally developed refueling stations. So, and you see that kind of localization reflected across all of the different industry areas. And second, this ambition and commitment is really reflected in the volume of public resources that is being devoted to the clean green transition. And of course, there's lots of details of those volumes in the policy brief itself. And third of all, I think what's really distinctive and and what reflects a high level of ambition and commitment is the really close collaborative government business relationship in Korea, the way that government and business work closely together over the long term, not just in devising the plans, but in implementing them, in monitoring the outcomes, ensuring that things are on track, and tinkering and changing, when things aren't. And fourth, this ambition and commitment is reflected in the degree of risk that the government is willing to wear, government kind of as a risk taker, in making some bets on the technologies of the future. And so if we think about hydrogen, these bets aren't just recent, but they date back in that area, to the 1980s, and they're bets over the long term. And fifth, I think that we see this ambition and commitment in a willingness to experiment with all available policy instruments to get the job done. So in Australia, under the previous government, we had this idea of technology, not taxes. Well, that immediately cuts off, a whole heap of policy instruments that you might be willing to pull, levers that you might be willing to pull, to not just create those green energy industries of the future, but to expedite the kind of stable phase out of the fossil fueled industries of the past. So I think all of these things make Korea's approach really quite distinctive and quite different from the kind of approach that we've seen in Australia, certainly over the last decade or so. And I think it's important just to mention really briefly, if I can, where does this ambition and commitment come from? How can you account for it? And as I mentioned previously, Korea's green shift isn't really motivated principally by climate change concerns. It's an issue, but that's not the primary driver. It's really about addressing serious energy security and economic security and environmental security concerns that are associated with its overwhelming reliance on not just on fossil fuels, but on fossil fuel imports. And that import reliance is now causing major challenges to the competitiveness of Korea's manufacturing-based industries. And in Korea, we know that a strong manufacturing economy since the 1960s has been seen as fundamental to Korea's national security, not just to its economic security, but its broader conception of national security. So this fossil fuel reliance is causing concerns about manufacturing competitiveness, but also environmental security. But the main concerns there are particulate pollution caused by coal-fired generation in particular. And this is a big political legitimacy concern for the government. So in this context, this Korea's Green New Deal is about really aimed at solving those problems by manufacturing energy security, manufacturing economic security, and manufacturing environmental security by building the new green industries of the future. And I think there's probably a lot for Australia to take away in that kind of approach.
Thank you very much. A very comprehensive answer, and I look forward to unpacking a lot of that through today's discussion. I now want to ask James, if I can, another scene-setting question, more about the Australia-Korea relationship. As I mentioned, and Philip alluded to as well, the Australia-Korea relationship has really gained a lot of traction over the last, in particular, 2 years, I'd say. Of course, last year we marked the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations. And in December last year, we had a presidential visit from the former President Moon Jae-in. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more broadly about the Australia-Korea bilateral relationship, both from a sense of the economic opportunities, but also perhaps defence as well.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you to the Asia Society for holding this meaningful event. It's a pleasure to be here as part of the panel. Australia-Korea relations have always been close, but I don't think here in Australia we understand the importance of the economic dimensions of that relationship. Korea has always been, certainly my career, one of our top 4 trading partners. At the moment, it's our 4th largest export market, 4th largest two-way trading partner. The resources and energy supply chain that we have with Korea is vitally important to our resources industry, vitally important to our GDP, vitally important for jobs here in Australia. The unfortunate thing with Korea is that it's always stuck in between the two Northeast Asian giants, China and Japan. And the resonance and the image that both those countries, China and Japan, elicit in the Australian population is probably higher in terms of recognition than Korea. But I think right now, in terms of our relationship, we should be reimagining the relationship, because Korea is a steady state trading partner, very important two-way trading partner. But as we've just touched upon, we're at the stage of potentially diversifying and leaping forward into a new dimension in trade and investment as we both our countries look at decarbonising. But as Liz mentioned, though, there are various aspects of this relationship. It is the economic trading partnership. Companies such as POSCO, the biggest steelmaker, one of the biggest steelmakers in the world, has played an ongoing role in buying the resources from Australia, coal, iron ore. It's probably one of our single most important customers globally. But then you have companies such as Hyundai Motors, SK, LG that are increasingly look at the Australian market, not just for hydrogen, but they're now looking at sourcing materials that go into their new industries, such as battery technology, as they seek to become the world leaders in the next generation of EV battery supply. That in itself will also be a very important role as we have all the resources such as lithium, graphite, nickel that goes into electric vehicle batteries. But then more fundamentally though, our relationship is diversifying into a broad strategic partnership encompassing not just economics, but defence partnership. Many here in Melbourne would have picked up the big announcement of Hanwha Defence looking at building a manufacturing base as they look at building supplying the contracts for Australian Defence Department for infantry fighting vehicles and also their K9 howitzer. But then I think more fundamentally to all people out there, especially the younger generation, Korea is now a magnet for international attention. Its soft power capabilities, its ability to inspire, to create images for the world through its music, through its movies, through its dramas, which probably everybody's binged upon in Netflix during the COVID lockdown era. But I think this is a fundamental issue now for us here in Australia, how we reimagine the relationship and take forward these broad brush opportunities, not just in the economic sphere, defence sphere, but the people-to-people aspects and broadening the ties between our two countries across the broad range of sectors.
Thanks very much, James. And I think one of the most common phrases that we hear amongst leaders such as yourself working in the Australia-Korea relationship is that the full potential of the bilateral relationship has not yet been realised. So I think these types of events today and the work that Liz has done in her policy briefing just help us take that next step in the relationship. As Philip mentioned, we've had a change of government both in Australia and in Korea, and this is going to mean very different things for both of our countries. In Korea, there's a shift from the Democratic Party to the PPP, the People Power Party, from President Moon now to President Yoon Suk-yeol. And in Australia, of course, we've seen the return to the Labor Party. Fiona, I might come to you here. What are you observing in terms of the change in climate change policy or energy policy from the Albanese government? And what do you think, or what opportunities do you think that presents for this hydrogen and decarbonisation strategy for Australia?
Thank you, Liz. And it's a pleasure to be here. It's really early days, obviously, for our new government, and they've been appropriately busy dealing with Australia's current energy issues, which are a result of a diabolical combination of things. But overall, I feel positively about the government and its desire to engage on matters about climate change and responding to it appropriately. At the pre-election stage, when there are election commitments being made, certainly from my perspective on the world of hydrogen, we had found that the then incumbent government had made a number of commitments and election promises, and Labor either sort of happily said we'll do the same thing or was sort of generally supportive. So I anticipate, can't guarantee anything obviously, but I anticipate that the things that were in train prior to the election will continue on, and that they will also hopefully be built upon, because there is we had the government coming in saying we will respond to climate change, and hydrogen and its derivatives are a very important part of doing that. Secondly, because the argument we've been making for hydrogen, for a while now has actually not been the environmental one, but the economic security, the national security one, and they should be very sort of alive to that. And then thirdly, because they are confronting the energy crisis, and hydrogen is a way of supporting us being in a position in future years to not have the same degree of crisis. Sorry, is my microphone a little bit patchy? No? Okay, all right. So yeah, I think that the issue then is just how do we get time now to talk about those longer term issues when it's energy ministers live and die or stay in power based on whether the lights stay on and bills stay down. So that's a pretty big issue for them to be grappling with. And I think we've just got to make sure that that longer term ambition, the good news story of hydrogen doesn't lose its urgency because it can be dealt with later. But I have no reason to believe that's what's going to happen. It's just a matter of us making sure that we engage well. But I feel positive. I think we'll have everything we had before and hopefully more.
Great. Thank you. And John, I'm going to come to you soon, but I want to come back to Liz and just ask for any observations you might have in terms of the change of government in Korea from President Moon to now President Yoon. And if I know it's still early days, but if there's anything that we can learn from the first few months of Yoon's presidency in terms of the decarbonisation and the decarbonisation agenda.
Sure. Thanks, Liz. Well, look, yes, kind of like the situation we're seeing in Australia. Korea's new President Yoon came to power early this year, just as the Ukraine crisis was really hitting and energy prices skyrocketing. And so it is grappling with that incredible spike in energy prices as we all are. And I think, in the long term, this recent crisis is only going to really amplify Korea's long-standing energy security concerns and its desire to reduce its reliance on fossil fuel imports. So, but when it comes to the difference, and that's a similarity with the Moon administration. When it comes to the differences from the previous administration, the previous President Moon had pledged to phase out coal, but also to phase out nuclear as part of a 100% renewable vision, with green hydrogen really at the centre of that strategy. So I think we'll see with President Yoon will retain that focus on hydrogen, but the new president really does have this focus on nuclear as well as a part of making that clean transition as affordable and as quick as possible. And I think really the spike in global energy prices and gas prices have only increased his resolve in that area. And the new president also sees nuclear as a really important export industry for Korea, especially the modular reactors. So, and there is a big but there, I think, is that there's going to be a lot of obstacles there domestically. Nuclear is still really a very divisive political issue in Korea, and the previous president's pledge to phase out nuclear had created a lot of investment uncertainty over that past 5 years. And we're only going to see this presidential term last for another 5. So and given those domestic divisions, what will, the next leadership say about nuclear? So I think there's going to be a question around investment certainty in the nuclear space that that might well trouble those plans. But I think, coming back to hydrogen in particular, we'll probably see Korea ramp up its ambitions in this area even further, and especially in response to China, because China now has announced its own really hyper-ambitious goals for green hydrogen, and Korea is very keen, as usual, to just stay ahead technologically of China in that space. So it's very hard. It's early days, hard to predict, but they're some of the factors that I think will shape energy policy in the next 5 years.
Thank you. And John, I'd like to bring you in here. We've talked a little bit about the political landscape and also what's happening geopolitically in the region, but also with Russia and Ukraine. How are you seeing this play out in terms of the trends for investment in hydrogen and interest in hydrogen generally?
Oh, look, I think it's very clear that there is huge interest in hydrogen. We as a bank have started to look at it very significantly, and that's been driven a lot by our customers. So when we look at the space that I'm part of, which is resources, energy, infrastructure, it's right at the epicenter of that interest in hydrogen. So we're certainly dealing with a lot of Korean customers who have operations in Australia and are very definitely seeing hydrogen as a potential answer to the situation that Liz described before in terms of energy security and that renewable theme. So I think that's been really important focus. And clearly, while hydrogen is still, in terms of renewable hydrogen, getting into commercial scale, there's a lot of homework being done. So I think it's really important. We're seeing it from our clients. That's pushed us to think about the industry and indeed make sure that we understand it. And we published a handbook to educate ourselves and eventually educate our clients as well. So we think it's going to be a really important factor in helping decarbonise the global economy.
Great, thank you. And James, you also work with a number of Korean companies. How are you seeing them respond to this decarbonisation agenda, and what types of themes are you seeing?
Sure. Firstly, I'll just make a point here. For Korean firms that are interested in hydrogen and the low carbon future, they're not doing it because of goodness of heart. They're not doing it because they care about climate change passionately. They're seeing the trends in the global marketplace and they're capturing the opportunities for future commercial gains. That's what they're seeing. And there are I'll unpack some of the dynamics that I saw certainly in Korea. And it certainly wasn't forced by the Korean government either, because some of these Korean companies were investing in these opportunities about a decade ago. Firstly, it's the pressure from international investors. The big pension funds throughout the world are now going through the books of all companies looking at the carbon footprint. And there's strong pressure on Korean companies right now to look at their carbon footprint, because some of the big companies such as Samsung Electronics, POSCO, Hyundai Motors are probably the worst emitters in the world. Well, probably not the worst, but certainly in terms of their supposed performance as an advanced economy, it certainly lags far from many other better performers. So there's a strong push for RE100 commitments, strong push for net zero commitments, again, externally. But the big dynamic changer, I think, recent times has been the European Union. The standard setting on things such as electric vehicles, phasing out internal combustion engines, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which foreshadows now a carbon price placed on manufacturers that don't meet EU standards. The Koreans have been looking at this for decades and have been trying to position themselves to capture the opportunities in this new commercial environment. So you have Hyundai Motors now going full bore into electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. You have POSCO, who I mentioned before. I met the POSCO chairman about 3 years ago, and he wasn't quite sure what to do with hydrogen. And in the interim, in those 3 years, he's now made a commitment to produce green steel by 2050, which is steel manufactured without coking coal, but using hydrogen with zero carbon emissions. He now has to find out how he can start producing 5 million tonnes of hydrogen by 2050. And they're actively exploring opportunities here in Australia. So there's been a dramatic shift in thinking among Korean corporates, again, not because of kindness of heart, but because this is the future they face. They're facing a low carbon future where carbon emissions will be taxed or priced into the market. So they're shaping the market, shaping their products to take advantage of the future opportunities. And I think that's where Australia also has to start looking carefully at how we do things, that the world is changing, our partners are changing. So I'm glad that we've moved beyond the political rhetoric of climate change wars. We have to shape the narrative of low carbon future, not in terms of costs, but in terms of the global trends and the huge opportunities that we will be able to capture if we start looking at our partners and what they're doing in areas such as cars, steel, energy. And let's hope that we're placing ourselves in a wonderful place to capture these opportunities. Thank you.
Could I ask a follow-up question on that in terms of POSCO? You mentioned that POSCO is one of I think it's our single largest customer. They've got a very long and rich history of investment in Australia, and they're actively continuously looking at the Australian market for further investment opportunities. Could you explain a little bit more about the green steel opportunity and what this presents for Australia?
Well, firstly, I think we have to look at what POSCO buys from us right now. It's an awful lot of iron ore. It's an awful lot of coking coal and thermal coal. That thermal coal component of their trade with us will shift in the future, and we have to prepare for a dramatic change in the composition of what they buy from us. But if they have to start producing green steel by 2050, it means that they replace the coal with hydrogen, either by importing the hydrogen from Australia or other producers, take it to Korea in their blast furnaces, refit their blast furnaces to inject hydrogen to create direct reduced iron, and they use electric arc furnaces to produce green steel. Now, the other option that POSCO, or indeed Australia, should be looking at is, can we do some more of the processing here in Australia, where we have vast resources available in the Pilbara of renewable energy adjacent to our iron ore supplies? Can we produce what's called hot briquetted iron, which uses hydrogen, reduces the iron ore to an iron pellet, which then gets exported to Korea for manufacture into steel product? All these processes are being considered by steel manufacturers because they have to start looking at the optimal supply chain, how they still make a profit, but then also for POSCO, indeed many other steel producers globally, what happens to their legacy investments in their infrastructure at home? How do these reshaped supply chains impact on their profitability and their jobs back home? That's a very difficult equation they have to start balancing out. But the bottom line is, as POSCO looks at producing green steel, or indeed all steel manufacturers in the world start looking at green steel, they have to look at hydrogen. And Australia is a great place to either supply the hydrogen or indeed provide products that are manufactured in Australia that goes into green steel. And hopefully, as I said, our policy settings, our corporates, our state and federal governments look at these opportunities and create the policy settings which ensure that we capture some of these great opportunities over the next decades.
Thank you. So as you've mentioned, John, government has a very strong role to play here in terms of developing the right policy settings. But given that you're from a finance background, I'd like to ask you, what role does private finance play in terms of encouraging investment into Australia?
Oh, look, I think private finance industry is going to look at this as a huge opportunity for growth. The energy transition represents significant opportunities for the banks, and we as a bank are looking at this area very, very closely. Indeed, we have environmental sustainability strategies in place designed to pick which are the sectors that we think are going to benefit from the whole energy transition. And we think that our clients are going to be well placed to be able to position themselves. So we're looking at it very closely. I think banks like ours will develop products, services, advisory capabilities, and of course, ultimately financial capabilities so that these plans can get to commercial reality. So from that perspective, I think the financial institutions have a significant role to play. And we as a bank are looking at it very closely. I think it aligns with our own purpose. And certainly, I think from that perspective, it represents significant opportunity, not just for the financial sector, but indeed for Australia. And I think that's an important element of what James just mentioned before. So I think there's going to be huge opportunities. The transition is going to take, many years, some say decades. And from that perspective, I think the opportunity set is going to be very significant.
Great. And Fiona, we've heard that green hydrogen and green steel and green is the end goal. But as John mentioned, it is a transition that might take decades. We've also heard a lot about in literature about the different colours of hydrogen, and it seems like there's a whole rainbow of colours. I wonder if you could help explain to us some of the different colours of hydrogen and how do we eventually get to that green hydrogen at the end?
Thank you. There are multiple colours, and those colours do sometimes they're more region specific. And obviously we know hydrogen doesn't have a colour, so the colours are there to denote the relative cleanness of the hydrogen or its means of production. So yes, everyone talks about green, and green equals renewable. And there are some sort of points of contention, but overall we're talking about using water, putting it through an electrolyser, so the process of electrolysis, and turns it into hydrogen and oxygen. And a fuel cell does the same thing, but the other way around. So that's the renewable version is the green version. The blue version is when you're making it through more traditional fossil fuel methods, but you're doing something with your carbon emissions. So we're talking carbon capture use, so carbon capture and use or carbon capture storage. And then there's this pink that's referred to overseas. There we go. I keep hearing myself differently, which is the nuclear version. I think some others call it purple. There's turquoise, which is made through methane pyrolysis, where you are using methane to produce actually sort of carbon black or graphene. You can sell that on a market, and hydrogen. So there's a range of things. But for most parties, it is this almost moral debate between green and blue, and where do we focus our attention? And unsurprisingly, people who are in the world of selling things that make green hydrogen or would like to very much go down that path, and people who are in the world of selling traditional fossil fuels or have access to storage are more keen on blue. None of that's particularly surprising. It's the way markets work. There is still a degree of there's disagreement about the role of blue hydrogen in getting to our green future. Many people, at least historically, thought blue could be a way of getting there, but everyone had different views as to how quickly. People are increasingly wanting to see blue taken off the table entirely, the green side, just because they are concerned about carbon capture and whether it's effective, whether the storage is effective. We take the view at AHC that it's too early to take blue off the table. It'd be too bad if the pursuit of perfection meant that we didn't get our industry up at all. At the same time, it's a really uncomfortable position to be in because it helps sometimes to be sceptical about existing vested interests and how they might want to protect themselves. And it would be reasonable to suggest, or rather, it would not be unreasonable to suggest that some parties might be seeking blue hydrogen as a way of maintaining their fossil fuel incumbency. However, we're not going to do this without the oil majors. We're not going to do it without major companies who know how to do major scale projects. It is reasonable to want to use assets and infrastructure which people are still paying for. So, I think it's about there being possibly a greater recognition from some quarters about what a transition actually is. Mm-hmm. But it's always going to be a tricky and sometimes morally challenging place to be. Ideally, we're not talking about colours. We're not getting caught up in particular terminology. We're just counting the carbon emissions associated with how hydrogen was made. And if they're as low as the end customer needs them to be, then that should be fine. As long as obviously you want regulatory oversight. You want to make sure that things are not, that people aren't missing the targets they need to meet customer requirements and regulations. But we're going down this path. Hopefully, we will continue going down this path of this guarantee of origin piece of work that's happening internationally that Australia is part of as well, that helps people certify and understand, it helps an end customer know what they're buying. And if there's other glorious, colourful ways of making hydrogen, we don't need to get caught up in that. We can just say, all right, here's the threshold of what's acceptable. And you have to demonstrate you're under that.
Yeah. Fabulous. John, coming back to you, we've heard of some of the challenges in transitioning to a fully green future. What are some of the other aspects which are holding back perhaps Korea and other East Asian countries in terms of a fully green transition?
Well, I think Liz spoke earlier in her initial address where energy security has become a really important issue. And that's heightened, obviously, in Europe, where the Russian-Ukrainian war is occurring. And you've got countries like Germany who've, effectively getting a large chunk of their fuel sources cut off. So I think energy security has become an important element of the energy transition. It's not saying that energy transition is delayed, it just means it's another factor to consider. But with Korea, who, came from an agricultural economy now to a very dynamic industrial economy over the last 65 years, it's fair to say that other economies in the region are going at the same pace. So it'll take time. And every country will have its own limitations. And therefore, I think you'll find that they will go at a different pace to, say, Korea or Japan. But nonetheless, I think that there is concerted effort, and I think the region will come together and effectively assist each other. But I think you'll find that affordability is becoming another key element of the whole energy transition, and it's sometimes termed as a just transition, where the affordability equation becomes important. And we're seeing it happen in Australia, where people are starting to get bill shock. And industries are also feeling the pinch of very high electricity and gas pricing. So I think that affordability also becomes a really good issue to deal with in the whole energy transition. So that's going to be important, and clearly countries have got to decide how that can be done. And not all the economies are as vibrant or developed as Korea.
It's a great segue to my next question to Liz, in terms of what other countries are doing in terms of their transition. You've done a bit of research on China's transition. I wonder if you could help us understand and compare what China's doing relative to Korea in terms of that energy transition and pace.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Thank you, Liz. And yes, the ARC project that I'm part of with a broader team looks at both Korea and China. And despite obviously having very different political systems, we find, the approach to greening is very similar in China, and indeed in Japan, in Taiwan. We see, in these other kind of manufacturing powerhouses in East Asia, really similar drivers of the clean energy shift and really similar levels of ambition, like hyper ambition, we might call it. And it's really the clean energy shift being this race to establish techno-industrial leadership in the manufacturing industries of the future. And also, of course, to address local environmental concerns that are very much centred on, particulate pollution and the enormous social and health costs associated with that, and therefore the cost to political legitimacy, which are very real and very appreciated. So across, Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, we see the governments taking a very lead role, obviously with business as well, being partners in the transition, really aggressively supporting that new green industry creation. And I think that this will have important implications for the speed of the transition as well, because obviously the more public investment and commitment that comes in, the more private investment comes in, follows. And then with manufacturing as well, the kind of steeper the learning curves, the greater the cost reductions. And so you see the government and market forces pushing in the same direction. And I think that is finally a really exciting prospect, and an exciting prospect here in Australia too, that we will see government and market pushing in the same direction. I should just say too that while I've been emphasising that, the primary driver in the region isn't necessarily climate change, it is obviously an important consideration, and the overall impact of a rapid energy transition will of course have positive implications for decarbonisation and climate change concerns as well.
Great, thank you. Now I am going to open it up to the floor in just 1 minute, but so please get your questions ready. But before I do, I'm going to ask a question to all of the panel members. So if you can keep your answers quite succinct. The question is, South Korea is Australia's 4th largest trading partner, as we know, 4th largest export market as well. As James mentioned at the start, some of our biggest exports to Korea are iron ore, coal and gas. But as both countries work towards achieving a net zero by 2050, what is one thing that you would like to see in the next 12 months to boost Australia-Korea low carbon collaboration? So I'm going to start with you, James.
That's a difficult question. I don't think I've
got one. One thing.
I just want a recognition here in Australia of the huge opportunities in the Korea-Australia trade and investment relationship, and that if we build it, they will come. And I'm not just referring to Korean companies, especially on hydrogen and critical minerals. It's the global supply chain that we will be at the centre of. So in short, if we build it, as in if we build the industry, if we create the right policy framework, if we nurture these industries appropriately, we will have a huge opportunity here in Australia, not just with Korea, but through the global supply chains as we decarbonise. So let's build it.
Fiona.
So I'm going to build on that. There's no perfect policy mechanism, but I'm just going to say I'd like to see a contract for difference approach agreed between Korea and Australia. There is the H2 global scheme between Germany and the world, and having some means of establishing policy to help unpack what the prices actually are. Because that's we actually don't know what people are prepared to pay. We just know that there's everyone's perception of risk. So understanding those prices and then filling them with government support, I think is a pretty good way to show everyone how serious we all are.
Great. John?
I'd like to see more Korean EVs and FCEVs in Australia. They've got some really exciting models coming out. In fact, one of them won Car of the Year. And so I think with that, with the hydrogen element and then the EV element, I think you'll find that represents really good two-way trade. I think the models are really exciting, very interesting, and I think will be priced right. So I think we'll start to see that emerge as a key theme over the next decade or two.
Great. And Liz?
Yes, so I have the political scientist hat on again, and I guess with an eye to the broader geostrategic environment. And I know that Australia and Korea have a lot to gain each other for collaborating economically, but I'd like to see us also keep an eye on collaborating to really expedite the clean energy shift for our regional neighbours. We have a moral imperative to do that, but we also have a really important geostrategic imperative to demonstrate that we are great development partners for our Pacific family in particular. And I think looking at what we can do together to ensure that our regional neighbours are enjoying the huge fruits of a green transition is really impossible. So to keep that on the agenda.
Great, some excellent answers there. I'd now like to open it up to questions from our in-person audience and wonder if anybody would like to kick us off with a question. Yeah, Jay, we'll go with James first. If you can just maybe stand up and introduce yourself, that would be great. Thanks, James.
Yeah, thanks everyone. James Scullen here from Asia Society. Fiona, I think I've got a question for you on what the future of Australian energy production looks like. Are we expecting to keep with the same energy producers that we have now? From Liz's policy memo, it mentioned that Korea's state-owned utility company KOGAS was transformed from a natural gas supplier to a hydrogen platform operator. In Australia, are we expecting the major energy producers to transform, or with hydrogen, is there space for new entrants in the market?
I'd say both. Again, it is a bit early, so it's tricky because we need to be making really solid long-term plans based on a shared view of the future and, and collaboration. But simultaneously, we're pre-commercial, but people are acting as though it could be commercial and they're competing with one another. So, and there's different visions, there'll be entities out there that think that hydrogen's time is tomorrow, and there's others who think it might not be for some time. It depends on what their businesses are. I think that we are definitely seeing, though, some demonstration of seriousness from entities moving into hydrogen. Say BP, for example, with the major announcement last week about their position that they're taking with the project in Western Australia. I mean, that shows they're serious. There's other entities like Fortescue, as you probably would have seen in the media, FMG, Andrew Forrest is repositioning that whole business as a green energy provider, not just an iron ore producer. So we're seeing these efforts to pivot from a number of companies. There's definitely room for the smaller, hungrier startups. What we haven't yet determined is whether a cumulative group of startups is more likely to get us to scale than one or two massive projects run by parties who know what they're doing because they're from an incumbent organisation. And I think it's going to be different mixtures in different regions. So we are seeing the shift, but it's pretty hard, really, for a business to invest enormous amounts of money into its hydrogen future while being in a country that hasn't valued hydrogen and hasn't valued carbon, that doesn't have carrots and sticks out there to help investment certainty. We would benefit enormously from having a way of activating a market and then seeing what people really are going to do.
Yeah, James?
I'll just add to the answer that Fiona has just given. You've given the KOGAS example there. I'll just clarify. KOGAS is going to be looking at liquefied hydrogen. And I don't want to get too technical, but there's another pathway to export ammonia, which is export hydrogen, which is ammonia. And in Korea, it's going to be the Korean National Oil Company that will look after the ammonia supply chain. But what's happening is there's a disruption of these supply chains because there are other players now, SK Gas, Hyundai Motors, and POSCO. They're all looking at building their own supply chain depending on what form of hydrogen they want, whether it's liquefied, ammonia, or indeed there are other sources of transporting hydrogen. So this is going to disrupt the whole monopoly, certainly that existed in Korea. But you're already seeing that in Australia as well, as Fiona mentioned. You have startups, small hydrogen companies, you have the big end of town with the energy companies, but then you've got companies such as Fortescue entering the hydrogen market. So I think this is going to play out over the longer term, and there will be many new entrants, and there's going to be disruption, certainly in energy markets, because we have so many new players entering into the hydrogen sphere.
Excellent, thank you. I think we had another question over here. Yeah.
My name's Ella. I work for John in the RNA team, ANZ. My question is actually directed to you, Liz. I'm just curious, so you mentioned, obviously the focus today is Korea and Australia, but you also mentioned China and Japan. and their sort of progression. I feel like obviously all those countries have very different political and sort of cultural environments compared to Australia and even compared to each other. So I'm just curious how we take some of the lessons learned there and apply them to here.
Yeah, look, this is a really, that's an excellent question. And I think there's no easy answer because it's really simplistic, I think, in some ways, just to go, oh, look at this menu of policies that are adopted elsewhere. You know, let's just employ those policies here. Well, that doesn't happen. You know, that can't happen for various reasons. And I think one of the, what I would say one of the biggest obstacles to Australia moving forward in a more kind of ambitious way, in which is a really close collaborative relationship between government and business of the kind that we tend to see in Northeast Asia, is, I guess, really different understandings about perceptions of the role of the state in the economy. Like what kind of role is it acceptable for the government to play in supporting new industries, in nurturing them, in kind of providing that suite of policies, not just about, you know, providing some subsidies here and there, but actually creating markets through procurement, for example, through creating the demand, and with the government being a smart purchaser. Often, you know, this is not. You know, we don't have the kind of the history of that, and we have a very different mindset about what it's appropriate for the government to do. So I think like that would be the highest level shift that's required. Often, you know, when you say the word industrial policy in Australia, people's eyes glaze over and they think government shouldn't pick winners. You know, like it's a really kind of quite simplistic, and of course it's not about picking winners. You know, winners tend to pick themselves when you provide a range of supports and make them conditional upon performance. For example, as often happens in the Northeast Asian context, it's not about subsidising white elephants, you know, forever. So because we have that very different history, that very different understanding of what's appropriate for the government to do, that's one of our biggest obstacles. And I think this is one of the great opportunities when we talk about, you know, what can we learn from East Asia? Why is it so important for us to become more conversant with what's going on in the region? Is not just to look at particular policies, but to really rethink the role of government as a smart player in this process.
Excellent, thank you. I've got more time for one more question, I think.
Hi, I'm Simon. I also work with John here at ANZ. I'm interested in the panel's views on reservation policies. I mean, hydrogen is a massive export opportunity, but we find ourselves in a very short position at the moment. I'm keen to understand what you think the government might do to make sure we have a low cost, stable supply here in Australia, assuming that's what Australians want.
Shall we go to Fiona maybe? No? Anybody else?
No, I can try. I would like to think that we wouldn't have that sort of problem because you can make hydrogen more easily. Like we're not relying on particular exploration sites and particular major contracts to bring those into fruition. That is not to say, however, that you could have it at scale and not be in a position where everything's contracted to go overseas, but we've created a domestic economy that in turn was itself reliant on hydrogen. I would have to say though that there would still all be less susceptible to international prices and international issues because everyone can make it themselves to a greater or lesser degree, and it'll be a more diversified market globally anyway. But I'd say at this stage we haven't made very much hydrogen at all green. So we're a way off. It is one of those issues, though, I think that needs to be built into policy frameworks as we see them developed. Just like just like resilience needs to be built into it. Like, you know, it's tricky with hydrogen because you want everything to be as efficient as possible. You need to squeeze every last bit of capability out, because right now we're pre-commercial, like there's no fat. But at the same time, you know, if you want something which is resilient to actual, you know, to fires and to natural disasters, you kind of need to overbuild. So how do we grapple with those sorts of issues where we need to look into the future and recognise risks to our future dependence on hydrogen before we've actually brought about that dependence? So I'd say it's a really important question that is made all the more relevant because of what we're seeing right now, but that it's kind of taken a position further back in the queue of all the things we need to resolve to get hydrogen up in the first place.
Great, well done. You tackled that one well. Would anybody else like to add to Fiona's answer?
I'll add to it.
Yep.
Maybe it's because I've been reading too much on what's happening domestically that I'll put in a view. I think it's too early to actually say that we have to put in a reservation mechanism on hydrogen. It's because we're not even close to, as Fiona said, making hydrogen here in Australia on a commercial scale, let alone industrial scale. But secondly, we have to look at what AEMO is doing in terms of its future projections for us as we move to a renewable future. And I would recommend looking at their hydrogen superpower scenario as they look at our rollout of renewable energy. And that looks at hydrogen playing a very important role as a support mechanism in our future renewable grid. Now, that's totally separate to hydrogen being built for export. So if we get these two markets right, ramping up renewables domestically and using hydrogen to be an addition to supporting our grid when we have excess renewables, but then at the same time building an export market which does cater to the huge demand pool for our export clients, we need to get that balance right. And it's going to be up to great policymakers, our bureaucrats, AEMO, as they look at some of these opportunities, but also risks, as they look at our future grid based on renewables. And I'm just hoping that they get these decisions right, because it would be vitally important for our future, both export markets, but also our domestic energy security.
Thank you. And Fiona?
Sorry. I just wanted to, I don't mean to be difficult, James, but AEMO is all we've got right now to give us scenarios and an understanding of the future energy situation. I just wanted to caution too much of a focus on AEMO though, because their remit is not looking at things off grid, and their remit is not looking at net zero as a whole. And so I do get concerned when people use the AEMO ISP as if it was a way of understanding net zero, or if it is a way of understanding what the future grid would look like with hydrogen. They've made some extremely big, well, it's based on hydrogen. Also, it is actually based on hydrogen for export as well. It does have in there the idea that it's all connected to the grid. We are not there. So it's great because it helps set the expectation of what needs to be created. But certainly our position as AHC is we need an AEMO-like entity. Now maybe it's AEMO 2.0, but we need something which that does what AEMO does, but with that broader remit, looking at net zero as a whole. That also does a better job, and this is not a problem with AEMO, but I think they're starting to see it as a challenge. How do you trade off the electricity and the gas infrastructure, knowing you can choose between the two? And hydrogen allows you to do that to a degree. How do we actually develop those scenarios that also provide for likely off-grid developments and try to put all that together into a future? So yes to AEMO, but not entirely.
Great debate and great discussion. I think on that note, I think we'll end the discussion there. We've talked about the geopolitical landscape, we've talked about energy security, we've talked about affordability, about the decarbonisation agenda, what the change of governments in both Australia and Korea means for both of our countries, the role of government policy, but also the role of the private sector. For me, some of the key takeaways is that there's a huge opportunity ahead, but we do need government to set the right policies for this to happen, and private finance and private institutions also have a really important role to play here. We also need to understand the context of the Australia-Korea relationship and the history of some of these organisations and the drivers, which may be different to some of the other drivers that we're seeing in other countries, to fully take advantage of this opportunity and to really harness the future of the hydrogen opportunity specifically between Australia and Korea. So thank you very much to the fantastic panel for your insights and observations. I think I'm handing it back over to Philip to close today's session.